So you were asking for signs about Jesus coming, and one of them being the ministers seeing eye to eye?
But if you're going to use the statement Isaiah, right, it says, the watchman shall lift up the voice together shall they sing, for they shall see eye to eye when the Lord returns again Zion, when he brings back his people. That would tie into the idea of the church being restored. There's got to be something that would occur that's going to change the freedoms that we have right now.
Right.
Now, again, there's people in other countries that say we've been dealing with that for a long time. But I don't think that is geographically limited. By that, I just mean, I don't think you could say, well, there's people, and there are. We've got churches right now in Kenya and other places that are under oppression and other things. But I don't think the fact that there are places around this world that are dealing with that problem have made it global enough for us to say that prophecy has been fulfilled. I think that's going to happen to all true Christians. When I'm saying true Christians, I'm talking about people that they're truly people who believe the Scripture and are willing to stand on the Scripture, a Bible-believing Christians. This has not happened corporately. There are still some bastions of strength in this world that are still, even though it's almost just nominal now, they're still Christian. This nation is still Christian, at least nominally. You know what nominally means? It means in name only. Sometimes someone can exist nominally for a while before they stop truly being something because they don't really want to give it up. So they hang on to it for a while before they lose the name, and they're not even caring if they're called that anymore. We still have a nation that, more than probably any other nation on this planet, has a Christian population. The problem is they are becoming less Christian no matter what they're calling themselves. Some of the things that we've had happen in our culture, in terms of decisions that have been made in the culture, and there's a number of them we could use, are prime examples of a culture that is, whether they realize it or not countercultural, it's counter-Christian. There are some things that just are what they are in the Scripture, and if you're going to be a biblical believer, you're going to have to stand on the Bible. It doesn't matter if the whole culture stands against you. And many of the Christians in our day, in the West especially, are becoming less real Christians. They're just Christians in name only, a lot of people, unfortunately. That, I think, is a precursor, something that will occur prior to what we're headed toward. It has to, because if you have a nation like the United States that at one point, I do believe, had a very strong Christian element to it, that has to be lost. There would be one of the list, if you wanted to list. The United States has to collapse spiritually, and it's already doing it right now. But I don't think it's going to be completed by September. In fact, I'm certain. If the Lord will return this September, I would be entirely astonished by it. There are just too many things that haven't happened yet.
If you see the persecution that took place in the early church, it came from spiritual people. It came from the professing godly people.
Yeah, a lot of times it's the most religious individuals. I'm not talking about Christian, but the most religious individuals. The reason Paul was such a strong persecutor of the church is because of how religious he was. He loved God. He loved God's law. And that's what caused him to be such a great persecutor. I think that will be part of the persecutory element in the last days that we haven't seen reach its peak yet. But I'll tell you what I think is going to be more persecutory than any other element. And I wouldn't have thought this when I was very young. I wouldn't have even seen this coming. When I was a teenager, it was the 1980s. That should give you an idea of the conditions going on culturally. We were almost, I don't mean spiritually necessarily, but there was almost a revival going on. It was a feeling of conservatism rising, and we're going back to, you remember even some of the statements made by the politicians, a city set upon a hill. Those are biblical statements. The feeling was an upswell. No matter how you want to look at it, you can critique the pieces and parts, but it was an upswell. I would not have imagined that in 30 years this nation would have gone from what it was in the 80s. There were plenty of people that were a mess in the 80s. But I mean culturally, from a conservative standpoint. We would go from the place we were conservatively in the 80s to the place we are now 30 years. 30 years. 30 years to somebody that's younger than 30, especially I'm thinking that someone's a teenager, is a long time. But 30 years to those of us that are almost double that age is not a long time. 30 years is a blink of an eye for this nation to change, take the kind of curve that it has taken. But do I think that, well, look, we're in September, aren't we? We're talking about next September now? Well, we're really in trouble if that's true. I didn't even think about that when you said that. All right, we've only got 30 days. You better get it together. You better have it together anyway. We better have it together anyway. We better live as if he's coming right now.
Right.
And there's a really simple reason for that, by the way. It's not because I think he's coming right now. I don't think it's possible for him to come right now.
Right.
Not that he doesn't have the power, not that the great God of heaven couldn't just say go, but God has, I'm going to come back to what I said, God has a method of doing things. God has a timetable. God's not going to change that timetable. He can change pieces within it, but he's not going to change the timetable. By pieces, I mean there may be some people that aren't included right now that'll be included by the time it's done. Isn't that an encouraging thing? I think there's some folks who are not included that might be included. But he's not going to change the timetable. There's still a window that's closing. But that window's not going to close in less than 30 days. There's just too many things, and we haven't even really listed them, and we haven't even really talked about a lot of the scriptures yet. What I was doing was trying to set a basis for why God works a certain way. And if you realize God works a certain way and he does it consistently, meaning you can find example after example after example, then when you come across scriptures where it's talking, and this is why I would take it from the direction I did tonight, when you come across scriptures that are talking about the people of God going through tribulation or not going through tribulation, you can rightly divide them. What kind of tribulation? Tribulation that worketh patience or tribulation that worketh wrath? Which one? Tribulation that results in destruction or tribulation that results in transformation? Which one? Because they're not synonymous. When we get to the end, which I don't think has begun yet, and there'll still be a matter of years wrapped up in the end.
Right.
Depending on how someone takes Bible prophecy, there are several ways to approach this too, anywhere from 3.5 years to 7 years to 7.5 years. But at least 3.5, and at most I would say 7.5 years that'll occur once the process starts, before there'll be a resurrection. And I don't think the process has started yet.
There has to be enough people to be a part of the bride, too.
What God is looking for has to be made up. That's right. Sister Helen?
One tribulation you were talking about in the future, will that purify and destroy?
We won't get into this much deep because of the time, but we can do it next time or another time. Here's where you would want to start getting into passages in Daniel and Revelation and elsewhere as well, not just Daniel and Revelation, even Joel for that matter, and other places, but Daniel and Revelation in particular, and determining where some of the seals are going to fall. Here's a perfect example of where one starting point would be. The seventh seal. Anybody know what it is? I'm not talking about the trumpets and the vials. Those are something else. What occurs when the seventh seal is opened? Who's got Revelation 8 in front of them? They can read it out for us. Read it out, Sister Cindy.
And when he had opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven about the space of a half an hour.
That half hour is the critical time. Trying to determine how long that half hour is. That's not 30 minutes. That's half of a prophetic hour.
7.5 years.
And there's where the debate rages about how long a prophetic hour is. But it's somewhere between 7 years and 15 years would be a prophetic hour, I believe. And we could talk about all that and what the reasons are. There are some good reasons, but it'd be one or the other. So half of a prophetic hour would be somewhere between 3.5 and 7.5 years. Half an hour. But whatever the half hour is, there's silence in heaven for half of an hour. That's the last half of the hour. Because the first half of the hour occurred in the 6th and 7th chapters. The first half of the last hour. So I don't believe the last hour has started yet. I don't mean we're not in the last days. You can get real general with it. But I mean the last hour. And remember, again, let me say this again. It's not a literal 60 minutes. It's a time period, and you just have to determine what an hour would be in the Bible. And without getting into all the technical elements, one way you would do that is to determine what a day is, and a day versus an hour. One way you would do that is to determine how God uses that terminology elsewhere. So there would be two approaches, and they can get into a lot of math and technical elements, and that isn't my intent. But regardless, when the last hour starts, in the middle of that last hour is when the resurrection of the dead is going to be, when the first resurrection is going to be. In the middle of the last hour. And the reason there's silence in heaven after that, that's not silence in third heaven. That's silence in the heavenly realm, in the religious realm. It's like sometimes it talks about the heaven and the earth, and it's talking about the civil and religious elements. Remember, we're in the book of Revelation, and the vast majority, not all of it by any means, but the vast majority of Revelation is in typological, prophetic, parabolic type of a language, symbolic language. There'll be silence. The silence is because the people of God have been taken out. By the way, if you want to know why I'm making this application, go to the 17th and 18th chapters of Revelation, and it describes what's going to happen during that time. This is the midst of this whole subject of where the tribulation is going on. During that time, there'll be no sound of the grinding of the mill, no voice of the bride or the bridegroom. That's Christ and his bride. No voice. There's silence. There's no voice. Whatever churches are sitting around the landscape, people are sitting in them, it's not the voice of Christ speaking. It's not the bride or the bridegroom. There'll be silence in heaven. Now, that's for the space of half an hour. Now, this is why you can back it up, because if there's silence for the space of half an hour, what happens at the end of the half hour? Noise. Something, a noise, right? Silence will cease, which if we're tying this again to Revelation 17 and 18, which I think it has to be, then, by the way, that I think is chronological. If you go through Revelation 17, 18, it's talking about the judgment that's going to fall on Babylon, which is false religion. You get into the 19th chapter we mentioned earlier, and Christ is coming back with his bride. And by the end of the chapter, he's pouring out wrath on the beast and the false prophet and the kings of the earth. That's Armageddon. Armageddon is at the end of the tribulation. It is the peak, the climax, the high point. And I don't think it's a day long necessarily. It may go on for a long period. But Armageddon is the peaking of that great tribulation. Now I'm going to put it in its framework. What started off with the persecution of the church, using the precedent of how it worked even with Israel in Egypt, what started off with the persecution of the church, that's going to be the final straw for God to bring judgment down this earth. This whole earth deserves judgment. But remember his precedent for how he did this. It's got to mount up. It's got to reach its level. What's the worst possible thing this world could do? Global persecution. We've never had global persecution. There's always been pockets of safety for the church. Even at times when it looked like it was going to be global persecution, when Europe became such a persecuting power against the people of God under that Catholic regime, even at that time there were places the people of God could escape. And God even opened up a way of escape. This is what's so precious about this nation. This nation was a way of escape for his church. The Protestant reformers came here to escape the persecution that was going on in Europe. God had window after window after window. They went through it, though. They went through terrible persecution, but he made ways of escape. So I believe the beginning of that period, the beginning of the last hour, will start with the church being restored and a number of other elements. That will go on for several years, depending on how you want to clock out the time frame. That isn't as critical right here because that gets real technical, but that'll go on for several years. It'll reach its peak. The first resurrection will occur. Christ will come and take his bride, and he'll go back to third heaven. There's the beginning of the 19th chapter of Revelation. He's in third heaven with his bride. And in the midst of that chapter, it starts describing all these incredible statements about Christ and him coming back on a white horse with the host of heaven behind him, which is, well, angels will be involved in it, but I think at the core of that is going to be the bride of Christ. The bride and the bridegroom are coming back to rule and reign. There's the next chapter. Not every chapter in Revelation, I would argue, follow this perfectly, but the last chapters of Revelation are extremely chronological. I don't think they're out of order at all. Once you get up to the place where Babylon begins to be judged, from that point on, it is just like clockwork. One hammer blow after another. Now look, there's hammer blows, the vials and the trumpets and other things going on, but those are included inside this overview. See, Revelation has repetition in it. That's what confuses people sometimes. It says something, then it says in a little different way over here. It's the same events from two perspectives. This is how I take it, so this is my own humble opinion. One perspective sometimes, say with the viol and trumpets, one perspective is what it would be like being in the midst of it on the earth. One perspective, I think, is what it's like looking at it from heaven. This is what it looks like when you're looking down on it from outside of it. This is what it looks like from the inside. Once you get to the last few chapters of Revelation, you get into the 17th chapter and on to the 18th, start talking about Babylon and the judgment that's going to fall on Babylon. That is false religion, but at its very heart, it's false religion masking itself as Christianity. And we get down to the judgments that's going to fall on Babylon in the 18th chapter, as I said. There's where you start hearing these statements that are a reflection back to what that 8th chapter was, and there's silence in heaven. There's no voice to the bride, no voice to the bridegroom, no grinding of the mill. Now, those aren't just talking about economic conditions, though there could be economic conditions going on as well. Those are talking about the voice of Christ being heard. The voice of the overcomers being heard. The grinding of the mill is the working out of the Word of God and all those other things that go into that symbolism that's in there. There's a lot of things going on there. Singing and other things that are involved in that passage. Then you go in, as I said a moment ago, I'm reiterating it. Then you go into the 19th chapter of Revelation, and here is Christ. And the marriage supper of the Lamb occurs in the beginning. Then Christ is seated on this white horse. He's being followed by the host of heaven. They're coming back. In the end of that chapter, they cast the false prophet and the beast into the lake of fire. And then we go into the 20th chapter. I do not think they're out of sync. I think the 20th chapter is a continuation. Beginning of the 20th chapter of Revelation, a mighty angel comes down from heaven with a great chain in his hand and binds the devil for 1,000 years. There's the millennial reign. Binds the devil for 1,000 years and shuts him up and puts a seal upon him so that he can deceive the nations no more. And then it tells you right after that, there are going to be those who are going to rule and reign with Christ for 1,000 years. They're going to be priests of God in Christ, and they'll reign with him for 1,000 years. How it says it in Revelation 20, doesn't it? Yeah. And this is, here's your key, this is the first resurrection. Yeah. The first resurrection is what is often called the rapture. That's the first resurrection. It's those individuals right there that are the membership of that first resurrection, ruling and reigning with Christ. That has to happen before the millennial reign. But that group is made up, it's finalized. The last elements of that group are constituted in the tribulation that leads up to the Great Tribulation. A building tribulation. It builds. The persecution starts with the church. I'm just touching this in an overview now. We can get in a lot of scriptures. But the persecution starts with the church. It reaches its place where everything has been done. I'm going to go back and again use these precedents. Once Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were in that furnace, and one like the Son of Man was standing there with them, we know that's Jesus, don't we? One like the Son of God is what it says there. One like the Son of God was in the furnace with them. I'd never use their Babylonian names. I have to think about it now. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were their real names. When those three men were in that furnace and the one like the Son of God came in and joined them, all the ones who were persecuting them, the very soldiers that took him up and cast him in the furnace were killed by the heat of the furnace. Isn't that interesting? The soldiers were killed by the same heat that burned away the bonds from those three young Hebrew men. And then once that was done, once the point had been made, a point had to be made because Nebuchadnezzar needed to see, there's a power greater than mine. The very soldiers I sent to throw them in there, the heat of the furnace just from casting them in took their lives. But there was a power greater than the power of Nebuchadnezzar, represented by that one that was standing with them in that furnace. And they came out of the furnace without their clothing being damaged, without any smell of smoke on their clothing, and with all of the bindings, all the rope work, the knot work that had tied them up to cast them in there burned away. That's a precedent for how God works, isn't it? God wanted to demonstrate something very clear. And I think God's going to demonstrate something in the latter days in the church. He's going to have a glorious church. Remember what Paul was calling for in his statement where we get that phrase, glorious church? He said that he may present it to himself, a glorious church, without spot, wrinkle, blemish, or any such thing. What does it take to take wrinkles out of a garment? I just reiterated this to myself about an hour and a half ago. Every Bible study. I know it's smarter, ladies, maybe when you get your clothes out of the laundromat or you get them out of the dryer to iron them right away. I never do that. I hang them up and let them sit. And then when I get ready to wear a shirt, I iron it. So I'm ironing before every service, you know. You may find that funny. Every service, I'm ironing whatever shirt I decide to wear that day. Heat. It takes heat. That's right. By the way, it doesn't just take heat. It takes heat and pressure.
7 times. Yeah.
They heated that furnace 7 times hotter. Going back to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, but it takes heat and pressure to take wrinkles out. And isn't it interesting? It said it's without spot, without wrinkle, without blemish, and any such thing. Nothing in it. What's going to take all the impurities out of the church is that process of tribulation. Without that process of tribulation, the church will still be an impure church. But it's once the process of tribulation takes out the impurities, and that happens in a lot of ways. Some of them are unfortunate. Some of them are people that are impurities that will not change. And they're in the church, but they're not of the church. The apostles talked about that too, didn't they? They said, they're with us, but they're not of us. If they were of us, they would continue with us. But sometimes it's the impurities, God forbid, chaff and other things that are within us or within us corporately that God is going to have to deal with. But once it's done, there's going to be a glorious church. Do you think he's going to have less than a glorious church at the marriage supper of the Lamb? I'm going to ask you an even simpler question. Do you think Jesus is going to marry a bride of lower quality than himself? this is where you got to apply some types and shadows, but read the 21st chapter of Leviticus, what the qualifications for the wife of a high priest were.
Yeah.
They're pretty high qualifications, a little different than just qualifications of the wife of a priest. Jesus is a high priest.
Yeah.
High qualification. A process is what completes that. There's going to be a glorious church. So there'll be a process of tribulation. Then there is going to be a catching away of the bride. First resurrection. If we're using Revelation 20, it's called the first resurrection.
In judgment.
Then judgment will begin to fall on Babylon and on the world as a whole. And that judgment will continue, even though I think it'll ramp up. It won't be an immediate collapse because it's going to come up to Armageddon. It'll ramp up into Armageddon.
That's pretty rough.
And if you read Isaiah 24 and other passages, we're talking about the earth shaking to and fro and tottering like a drunkard and like a cottage. It's talking about someone setting up a tent that the wind is blowing around. That's why I say we go into chapter after chapter and verse after verse talking about this subject. There's going to be a terrible judgment that's going to come on this earth. It's going to be brought down by Christ and by his bride. They will be the governmental figures that are going to rule over this earth. Let's go back to who asked that first question about Sister Sharon. About Adam and Eve being made in the image and likeness of God. That's what God wanted to begin with. He wanted a husband and a wife team in his image and in his likeness to rule over this earth. Look at the verses that follow Genesis 1:26. Genesis 1:26 where he said, let us make man in our image and our likeness. 28th verse of Genesis 1 when he gave them their fivefold command.
Be fruitful, multiply.
Be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth. Those are all growth-related commands. Then there's two commands that are related to dominion. Subdue it and have dominion over it. That's what Micah was talking about when he said, and thou, O tower of the flock, stronghold of the daughter of Zion. That's talking to Jesus. Jesus is the tower of the flock. He's the stronghold of the daughter of Zion. Unto thee shall it come. Someone have that in front of them?
Yes, that's it.
Unto thee shall it come,
Even
the first dominion. The kingdom shall come to the daughter of Jerusalem, or the daughter of Zion. What's the first dominion? What was the very first time that word was used in the Bible?
Adam.
That's right. What I just quoted in Genesis 1:28. Subdue it, and what Brother Koser read, have dominion over it. That's what Adam lost. He lost the first dominion.
Yeah.
The first dominion God intended mankind to have, not just one kingdom, dominion over the whole earth. Adam lost that. That's what the promise is all about in some of these beautiful snapshots in the Old Testament. Like Genesis 49, when Jacob is prophesying over his sons, and he says of Judah, that the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh comes. And unto him shall the gathering of the people be. Well, who's Shiloh? Shiloh's Jesus. You tie that to Ezekiel, when Ezekiel says, this is God talking about the kingdom of Israel, I will overturn it.
Yeah.
And then he shall come whose right it is, and I'll give it to him. Overturn what? Well, the whole context of that statement is the kingdom of Israel that's going to have their sovereignty taken away.
Yeah.
Well, when did he start overturning it? You notice he said, I'll overturn it 3 times. Sometimes the Hebrew language is used for force of repetition. Sometimes something is said like, woe, woe, and that's intended to tell you this is very bad. It doesn't mean there's 2 woes. It just means this is very bad. Sometimes it means there's more than one. This means there's more than one. That overturning is a process. What is overturned? You belong to one and you got given to another, right?
Yeah.
We're in the time of Ezekiel when this prophecy is being made, aren't we? Who had control over Israel in the time of Ezekiel? Where was Ezekiel at?
Babylon.
He was in Babylon. Israel had been given into the custody of Babylon by God in judgment. They were overturned from Babylon to Persia, to the Medes and Persians. Here's the second overturn. He overturned from the Medes and Persians to the Greeks. Babylon to Persia to Greece. And then the third overturning. They were overturned from Greece to Rome. So they should have been looking for their Messiah when the Roman Empire took command over them, because from the time that they were overturned unto Rome, the third overturning had occurred. So those 3 overturnings were taking them all the way from Babylon to Persia to Greece to Rome, and then Jesus came. And the one who was going to restore the first dominion came. Now back to Micah, where it says, unto thee shall it come, even the first dominion. Jesus and his bride are going to have the dominion restored to them that was lost by Adam and his bride. Remember what 1 Corinthians 15 calls Jesus? It says the first man, Adam, was a living soul. The last man, Adam, is a quickening spirit. See, it's comparing them. The first man, Adam, lost his inheritance. He lost the first dominion. The last man, Adam, is going to take it back, and he's going to have a bride at his side, just like the first man, Adam, would have had. And all that are part of the pieces and parts that have to go into what has to be done before the Lord will return. Some of it are elements that are going to occur after he returns, but if we really wanted to study out the specifics of the details of what is going to happen in between the beginning of the last hour and the time of the resurrection, we'd have to look especially at places like Revelation 6, see Revelation 8, because as I said, that 8th chapter begins with the opening of the 7th seal. The 6th chapter begins with a white horse. It's the exact same language in Greek, which is used in the 19th chapter for the rider on the white horse. It says, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat upon him. It's exactly the same Greek phrase, word for word, that's used in Revelation 19. But that process that began with the white horse in Revelation 6 is going to end with a white horse rider in Revelation 19. And in between there is what we need to be analyzing. So by the time you get to the 6th seal, we are in the period when the last hour is preparing to start its process. So there's elements of the 5th seal and the 6th seal that still have yet to occur. And then there'll be the 7th seal, but we're in between some of those places right now. So I said here in the beginning, there's the idea that there's a pre-tribulation rapture. That just means before there's any tribulation, Christians escape. And my quick, simple, pat answer to that, if I make a synopsis out of this, I guess, there's been tribulation going on for almost 2,000 years, and those dear folks, some of them who went through terrible brutality, didn't escape it. So the idea, the argument that the church is just going to escape tribulation is kind of a strange argument. It hasn't been escaping it for 2,000 years. I gave you examples of things that you couldn't have had worse tribulation individually, and they didn't escape it. So that'd be a difficult argument to make if you're just going to use common sense. Then there's a mid-tribulation resurrection, which just means that there'll be a tribulation that'll come upon this earth. And I think the main focus of that tribulation will be persecution on the church. And that persecution on the church will transition into God's wrath, which makes perfect sense, doesn't it? As God takes his church through and out of that, then his wrath will come on the world. He's not going to pour out his wrath till after he's delivered his church. And there's where people get turned around, because they're thinking it's all wrath. Anything bad that happens is God's wrath. Well, then there's a lot of wrath he's poured out on his people. If you're going to say anything bad that happens is God's wrath, I don't think that's what it's meant to say. Then there's post-tribulation rapture, which is the idea that the church is going to go through the whole thing, including, I think, among some folks, they think all the way into the millennial reign without a resurrection. I don't believe that. I think there'll be a first resurrection in the midst of that last hour, the midst of the last hour. But the last hour is going to be an hour-long time of great distress. Beginning is focused on the church, but ending is focused on this wicked world that persecuted the church in the first half of the hour.
It looks like it does two things. It purifies one group and destroys the other.
Yes.
Judges the other.
Well, you see that happen a lot, Brother Lee. That's very similar to the language that John used when he was prophesying about Jesus. And the two times it's recorded in the Gospels where he talked about fire, that he said, the one that cometh after me will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and with fire. And then he goes right into talking about how fire was going to fall in judgment to deal with the chaff. Well, there's a dual element to that.
Well, I think that goes in line with the Egyptians and the Israelites. It's the same thing.
That's exactly right.
And he let the Israelites go through part of that.
That's exactly right. And I'll tell you what it did for some of them. You might wonder, why would he have let the Israelites go through any of it? But I think for some of them it was a test. Will you stand? It's just like we've been using these examples, it's just like with Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He could have just made sure they weren't there that day. But he didn't. They were there, and they had to make a choice when that command went forth, and they played those instruments and said, when the instruments play, everybody fall down on their knees. They had to make a choice. He put them in a situation that was extremely difficult, where they would be forced to make a choice. And here's the thing about making a choice like that. This is what the whole point is about. Right. Individually, there is no greater choice you can individually make about yourself than to avoid pain and death. If you're willing to go through pain and death for the Lord, remember what Jesus even said, there's no greater thing that a man can do than to lay his life down for his friends. There's no greater love than this.
There's no way of fudging around the edge of it either. You had to make a total commitment one way or the other.
That's right. And this would be another just rational reason. Any of you been put in a position where you'll lose everything, including your life, if you claim to follow Jesus? There have been some people that have. Some of these school shootings, that exactly happened. People pointed a gun at them and said, "Are you willing to give up Jesus?" essentially. And they were willing to take that bullet and did. But as a whole, the church has, especially here in the West, we have had hardly any of the kind of persecution in the Western world that the rest of the world, the third world, and the East has had. There's part of the gospel going out to all the world, though you may not realize that would be included in it. The effects of the gospel message, the full gospel, is that there will have to be a testing of that truth. And part of the testing of that truth is, will you hold to it, no matter what tensions and difficulties and threats you might find yourself under? People have been doing that in other places of the world, but the whole world has not been under that kind of tension where somebody would say to you, you either bend on this, or you'll be in prison the rest of your life, you'll be executed, whatever other thing may occur to you. That type of process is part of the end testing that is necessary. And until that happens, what I find saddest about this is individuals who may not have undergone hardly any persecution, being the first ones to say, the Lord's coming for us.
Right.
They're the first ones, you know. It's these folks in these persecuted countries, I know because I work with a number of ministers overseas. They're not saying he's going to deliver us from this. They know what they're going through, and they're willing to go through it. It's over here where we're a little softer, you know, that we tend to get divisive over things like that and say, we're not going through nothing. I can see why you might say that. You may not be ready to go through it. I wouldn't word it like that to them, but the fact of the matter is, some of these folks who say we're not going to face any difficulty, well, they're not ready to face any difficulty is half the problem. What would happen if somebody looked him in the eye and said, I mean an angel of the Lord, or Jesus himself appeared to him and said, you are going to go through some very great difficulty. I wonder if some of the folks who are so determined that I'm not going to see any problems would hold on to the Lord. Sister Sharon?
Brother Bear, you made a statement, and I don't know if you'll remember the end of it or not, but maybe somebody else got it in their notes. And one of the statements was, Armageddon is the peak of, and we miss that rest of that statement.
It's the peak of what we think of as the Great Tribulation. It's the peak of what we think of as the time of Jacob's trouble. It says there's going to be a tribulation like there has never been on the face of this earth. That'll be the peak of it. The debate is, of course, related to the details, where the vials and trumpets fall. You know, once you start talking about Armageddon, then you get into that issue of whether the vials and trumpets are part of Armageddon, or whether they're part of the judgments going on during the millennial reign, or whether they're part of the tribulation up to Armageddon. But Armageddon, I believe, will be the peak. And in the midst of that, there's several things that will occur. See, even this will be a dual process. Do you realize Israel's going to come out of Armageddon turning to their Messiah?
Yeah.
My belief.
Yeah.
I think part of the process of Armageddon, it's going to destroy a massive amount of people. It's going to be destructive judgment. But in the midst of that destructive judgment, Israel's going to turn to their Messiah. You realize that several very strong prophetic statements demonstrate that? And I've heard sometimes someone with more of what you call a preterist view. They believe that all the prophecies have already been completed back in the first century. Revelation's already done. God's done with all that. I don't believe that, by the way, but somebody with that type of a view would tell you that that great tribulation was 70 AD when the destruction fell on Jerusalem and the temple. You realize that those prophetic passages are describing Israel turning to God in that? They didn't turn to God in 70 AD. Do you realize after 70 AD there were far less Jews in the Christian church than there ever were prior? In fact, that is almost a watershed moment for the church becoming primarily Gentile. In part because the Jews that survived 70 AD were highly antagonistic towards the Christians who had left the area because they felt like the Lord had warned them great trouble was going to come. A lot of the Christians left the area feeling like he had warned us this is going to happen, let's get to Syria or somewhere else. And they were never forgiven by their Jewish brothers for that. And that was one of a number of things. One of the things that really severed the line between Jews still coming into the church and not coming into the church. One of a number of things. There were terrible things the Gentile church did later to the Jews as well, but that was one of the things, that there was an animosity there, a prejudice that was created, and they didn't turn to their Messiah. When are they going to look upon him whom they pierced and mourn as one mourns for his only son? When is a third part going to come through the fire and be purified by it and turn to their Messiah? Those are prophecies that haven't happened yet. Now, if someone wants to talk about that, there's another element of individuals who are God's people, though they don't even know they're God's people. Well, they think they're God's people, but they're not really God's people, but they don't know that they're going to be the people of Christ, those who will turn to Him. They're going to have to go through the whole tribulation. I'm not talking about the church. I'm talking about natural Israel. They'll have to go through the whole tribulation. And I believe a third part. You know what that would mean if that is applied to them? Which I personally believe it is. That would mean 2/3 of the natural Jews on this planet are going to die. And a third part. I know how gruesome that is. Think how incredible that statement is. Do you know how resistant, especially people that are more religious Jews, not just genetic Jews, I mean people that are truly religious Jews, do you know how resistant they are to the message of Christ? I mean a terrible, deep prejudice against Christ. As horrible as it sounds that only a third part of them will survive, do you realize that 1/3 of them will turn to Christ? Think what an incredible number that is. Those are the scriptures where it talks about how they'll look upon Him whom they pierced. They'll come out of that fire. So I believe the bride will be taken out in the midst of that last hour. But I believe the nation of Israel is going to go through the whole hour. And they're going to come out the other side, and here's when they'll see the one they've pierced.
Yeah.
When He comes back with the bride.
They won't turn to Christ till He does appear among them.
When He comes back with His bride,
Yeah.
they'll see Him descending. They'll see Him coming back. When He comes for His bride, the only ones that are going to hear that trumpet are the ones who are redeemed. Like that song that I like so much. Only the redeemed will hear His voice in that day when He comes in clouds of glory to catch His bride away. No one else will even hear His voice. When He comes back for His bride, nobody will see Him or even know He's there but His bride. When He comes back with His bride, the whole world is going to see Him.
He don't appear when He comes for His bride?
Only to His bride. Only His bride sees Him and hears His voice. That trumpet that will raise the dead, so to speak, that trumpet, when it says in 1 Thessalonians 4, it says that He'll descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel and the trump of God, that'll be a trumpet blast powerful enough to raise the dead, but no one will hear it but the dead in Christ.
She's the only one supposed to rise.
But when He comes back, the whole world's going to see and hear Him.